Hi there everyone, Foyfluff here, and yesterday we ran this MonoU Devotion deck through a League of Pioneer in Magic Online, and in this video I'm going to give you a quick deck tech, a rundown of how those games went, and then I'm going to offer you my final thoughts on that deck. But first, let me just quickly say that if you enjoy this video and you would like to see more like it, then please do consider subscribing. We're aiming towards 1,000 subscribers. We're getting there slowly, so come on, join the group. It's very fun. And if you would like to see these streams live, then I stream a League of Magic Online every Wednesday over at twitch.tv/Foyfluff, starting at 12 PM GMT. We also stream on Saturdays and sometimes on Fridays, so if you would like to catch those live, come over, links in the description below, so come and follow the stream and you can catch it live. Alright, let's get into those game rundowns. In game 1, despite a strong looking opening hand, our opponents were faster than us. For a second it looked like Master of Waves might have just given us enough blockers and tokens to be able to stabilize, but a stasis snare from our mono white opponent took it out, and even though we were able to bounce the snare and get some blocks off, it just wasn't enough in the end. We go into the sideboards, and because most of their creatures look pretty small, and obviously Devotion is a concern for their deck, Domestication seemed like it might be good enough to slow them down. We brought those in, as well as Annul and Sensory Deprivation over Callaphe and Ashiok's Erasure. Game 2, a Master of Waves right on curve seemed promising, but Walking Ballista proved us very wrong in that regard. Although we were able to steal a few of their threats with Domestication, the top of our deck was not kind to us, and their ability to pump their Walking Ballista and dump our creatures every turn made it very difficult for us to get anywhere. Hellbent on turn 9, we draw our last card and hope for the best. It's a Master of Waves, also known as a 4-mana remove 1 counter from Walking Ballista. We concede. Game 1 of match 2, and our hand actually curves out pretty well with Witching Well into Omen of the Sea into Thassa, while our opponent plays Fabled Passage, fetching for a swamp into Castle Vantress into Nykthos, which tells us that they're on Mono Black Devotion. I think the passage is meant to enable Revolt on Fatal Push, but the potential to get basics and tapped in a mono-colored deck seemed really loose to me. Our opponent seems to get stuck on lands for most of the game while we draw many cards and do general Devotion things. By the time we find a Nykthos with 2 copies of Witching Well on board to guarantee a lot more card draw, our opponent gives up the gun and concedes. Our sideboard doesn't really have much that targets our opponent's stuff against a black deck, so we just decided to run it straight back. In game 2, we keep an incredibly risky 6 based on having Nykthos and Leyline in our opening hand. While our deck refuses to give us another land, our opponent plays Thoughtseize, followed by Yarok's Fenlurker, followed by a Yarok's Fenlurker and a Thoughtseize, followed by Liliana and another Thoughtseize. We didn't want our hand anyway. Eventually they drop a Gary, draining us for 8, while we still only have 2 lands, and we decide that the win just isn't in the cards for us. Game 3, running it back again, we keep a mono 3-drop hand based on having 3 lands and knowing it's unlikely we get to keep those cards in our hand anyway. The game ends up being surprisingly grindy and very back and forth, but eventually we take them out thanks to Thassa's ability to make our whole team unblockable. In game 1, our opponent drops a Mausoleum Wanderer, telling us that they're on blue-white spirits, and we immediately despair. Their interaction is cheaper than ours. We have 0 flyers in the deck, they load up some spirits with Curious Obsessions, beat us in the face, draw many cards, while we do essentially nothing. Cool. Our sideboard seems designed to counter blue decks almost exclusively, but we know that they'll probably be bringing in the exact same cards. Nothing to do but hope for the best. In turn 1, they don't deign to play anything, so we try to get our Devotion build up with a Thassa's Oracle, but our opponent disputes that. On their turn 2, they play a Mausoleum Wanderer, so we try again by casting a Gadwick, but our opponent disputes that also. They cast a Curious Obsession, which we attempt to dispute, but they counter it by sacrificing their Mausoleum Wanderer. We go to play a Master of Waves to try and race them, and they counter it with Mystical Dispute. Yep, by their turn 5, they've cast 3 copies of Mystical Dispute to our 1. We lose to some curiously obsessed flyers. In a sense, this was one of the best matches because it went by so quickly. Game 1 of match 4, and on turn 2 our opponent plays a pair of Burning Tree Emissaries, telling us they're playing the mono green Devotion deck that we very recently covered on the channel, link on the screen right now, but they don't have a follow-up for the second Emissary's mana, which gives us some relief as we start building our own Devotion with Callaphe into a Gadwick. On turn 3 they cast a Voracious Hydra with X equaling 1, doubling that to 2. Ends up being the last spell they cast as they appear to be stuck on lands, and they concede when we start tapping their blockers with Gadwick and threaten to close out the game with a monstrous Callaphe. By this point, I just have absolutely no love for Leyline of Anticipation or Ashiok's Erasure, so we take those out of the deck in place of Aether Gust and Domestications to try and pinch them on Devotion. In game 2, our opener is a 1-lander, so we mull into a 5-lander with a Wizard's Retort and an Omen. It's not a good hand, but it's probably better than a 5-card hand, and Omen can hopefully find us what we need. Unfortunately, by the time we get to cast 1 Omen of the Sea, they've cast 2 Elvish Mystics, a Jadelight Ranger, and a Voyaging Satyr. It's not all doom and gloom though. We get to counter a big Hydra, play a Thassa's Oracle, finding us a Master of Waves, then Aether Gust, another big Hydra. Quick disclaimer, that is a misplay. Considering we know our plan is to cast the Master of Waves next turn, it would have been way better for us to retort this Hydra, prevent them from being able to recast it to kill our Master. As a result, we're forced to not play the Master and instead spend our next turn holding up the Retort to counter the Hydra like we should have done the first time around. We draw Gadwick, so we spend our time casting that to try and ensure we have protection for the Master of Waves. We manage to stem the bleeding a bit and drop a Master with Devotion equal to 10, but they top deck a Khan, finding a Walking Ballista. If there's one thing a Merfolk Wizard hates, it's a Walking Ballista, the symbol of pinging X1s. Considering we set up our draws to have a second Master of Waves on top, we now look very, very silly. Game 3 is incredibly grindy as they deploy threats bigger than ours, but we consistently manage to tap them down with Gadwick. By turn 9, we're both still sitting at 20 life, and we could have likely very easily won with Thassa's Oracles if they weren't all already on the board, thanks to our incredible amounts of devotion. Instead, we try to close out the game with a Master of Waves. Thanks to Jade-like Explorer, we know they have a Khan on top of their deck and they can go and find our Nemesis Ballista, but we've held onto a Wizard's Retort for just that reason. They Khan, we retort, they Khan again. They had a second Khan. Oh dear. They find the Ballista but only have the mana to kill off our Master of Waves. We refill with Gadwick thanks to insane amounts of mana and manage to begin grinding harder than a Geordie lass in Digi Mondays. By turn 11 our opponent is hellbent and we're able to Aether Gust 3 different permanents to the top of their libraries with counter spells in hand for when they go to cast them. In response to the third gust, our opponent concedes. This is absolutely not the result that I expected. Game 1 of match 5, now our opponent leads on Thraben Inspector into Anafenza Kintree Spirit, so we're against another mono-white Devotion player. Devotion decks out in full force today it seems. While we managed to stall them for quite a while, in the end they muster an overwhelming army while we're stuck with 2 Leylines in our hand. Get these out of our deck as fast as possible, please. We go to sideboards and take out Leylines for Domestications, Sensory Deprivation and Annul. In Game 2, Sensory Deprivation does its job, combined with Brazen Borrower and Gadwick to slow them down. Eventually we drop a Master of Waves for 9 tokens, they go to cast our good old friend Walking Ballista, but we have Ashiok's Erasure to answer it, and they concede. Wow, Master of Waves actually doing its job, even against a Walking Ballista. In Game 3 our opening hand is not kind with no lands, our 6 is 6 lands and a Thassa, so we take it to 5 where we see 4 lands, a Witching Well and 2 Wizard's Retorts. We bottom a land and a Retort and hope for the best, but our opponent comes out of the gates very fast, applying a lot of pressure with Anafenza and a history of Benalia. On turn 4 we top deck a Master of Waves, which just might allow us to block half decently, just so long as there's no Walking Ballista in our opponent's hand. Much to our chagrin, not only is there a Walking Ballista in their hand, it's preceded by a Heliod for an infinite combo. GG, I wish our deck had an infinite combo. Okay, so that's the rundown of the league. Our final record was only 2-3, which is not that impressive. So you might be wondering, what do I think of the deck? I think it's problematic. It's slow, it's clunky. When its pieces come together, it can do some quite strong things, but quite often it just doesn't do things that are strong enough. The big payoff for having Devotion to blue is your Master of Waves, and there's just so many ways to kill a Master of Waves, especially when Walking Ballista is not only in the format, but is incredibly good in the format. Mono green decks want to pull Walking Ballistas, mono white decks want to pull Walking Ballistas, Delirium decks run Walking Ballista. Walking Ballista is just everywhere, and you know, for the low cost of 2 mana, or 4 mana if they want to keep the Walking Ballista alive, they just get to ping off your Master of Waves and completely wipe out all of the tokens that it made. And other than that, I mean, you're able to draw a lot of cards with Gadwick and do that thing. But it's not as solid of a plan as the other Devotion decks are. It really feels like all of the other Devotion decks have much better payoffs for being in that colour, and blue's just kind of like, well, I can counter things and draw cards a bit. That's not as good as just winning the game though, unfortunately. Alright, I hope you enjoyed this stream rundown. Please subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this one, and leave me a comment to tell me if you'd like this format of video. I'm always trying to experiment with different formats and find out what people like, and also what is possible for me to make. If you want to catch this stream live, as I said, twitch.tv/Foyfluff, links in the description box below. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.